So Dan's going to share a few things related to team science and some of a little bit of the nuts and bolts of it,
Yeah.
but also, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I know you got a lunch coming up at noon, so I'll go pretty quick, but a lot of this is pretty straightforward. And as Bernard said, I'm at UCI in these departments in the School of Social Ecology and also in public health. So what's happening in science, and this is from a study by Wookti, published in 2007 in Science. And what it's showing are these trends toward larger and larger co-author teams and happening in science and engineering STEM fields with patents, even in social sciences, and it's happening now in the humanities, even with digital humanities and the like. So there's this trend toward increased collaboration and team size in science. And it has some positive benefits in that papers that are produced by these larger co-author teams tend to get cited more, have more impact on the field. One of the reasons there's this interest in team science is there's a growing accumulation and specialization of knowledge. So Ben Jones at Northwestern University called this the burden of knowledge. So in 1903, the Wright brothers could build and fly their own little airplane. But by 2013, when the Dreamliner came out, there were something like 30 disciplines needed just to assemble the engine of that plane. So we have this proliferation of information, knowledge, and it's impossible for everyone to keep up with everyone's field. So you team up and you get together and you share, you fill each other's blind spots in a sense. Another reason there's a trend towards team science is the kind of complexities we're facing, from climate change to disease pandemics to societal polarization, violence, the chaos of the internet, all the kind of crazy things that can happen online, the fraud, the stalking, all of that, even though the internet and AI have brought us tremendous advantages. So there are those kind of challenges to try to deal with. And I mentioned in the other room convergence. And this is a priority. It has been for several organizations in the US, including the National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine. And they started in 2005 with this Facilitating Interdisciplinary Research report. And since that time, there have been a number of reports on convergence, on team science. In 2015, I had the opportunity to participate as a co-author of the 2015 report. Culture of convergence, how do you stimulate that in institutions like universities? How do you measure convergence in science engineering? And then most recently, the science and practice of team science. This is a 2025 report. And you can go to the National Academy's website and get all of these publications for free. So you can just download them, and they're great resources. But there's a huge interest in this and a commitment of resources to the topic. And when we say convergence, the way NSF defines it is it involves deep integration across different fields, driven by a compelling specific problem, whether it's climate change, COVID, what have you, biophotonics challenges, often leads to co-production of knowledge by researchers and community stakeholders. So there's more and more interest in not just interdisciplines within a university, but how do you connect those with professional elected decision makers, professionals, laypersons, citizens, to cultivate new knowledge and useful translations of that knowledge to community problem solving. Now, there's a lot of research over many years in organizational psychology, management science. We have a school of management here at UCI with organizational behavior specialists, and they study lots of different kinds of teams: military, factory, corporate, white-collar teams, surgical teams, emergency response teams. But science teams are kind of unique. And one of the reasons we have this surge of team science study is because science teams are trying to create something that often is very hard to measure and count. In other words, creation of new knowledge. And how do we evaluate that? And what do we count as a breakthrough? And often those teams are more porous than military or corporate teams. In other words, a lot of those teams are proprietary. Everything that happens among team members stays in that team. Universities, professors are sort of free agents. They can go from one collaboration to another. They can take information from one to the other. So there are a lot of things about science teams that have created this interest in, well, how do we sort of design really well-functioning science teams? So team science includes research projects that require collaboration to create new knowledge and integrate that knowledge. It can be taken by members of the same field. So you can have a laboratory, which is all about systems biology. Of course, that's a very multidisciplinary field too. Or you can have a much broader kind of collaboration where you have people from public policy and from sociology and biophotonics and other fields teaming up together. And increasingly, team science is relying on this interdisciplinary collaboration. So we have to become skilled at that and knowledgeable about it, to be effective in today's world of research. The field of team science is studying circumstances and managing those circumstances that lead to more effective collaborations, and also research and training and translational initiatives from basic science to practice. There's an organization called Insights, which has a yearly conference. These are some books that have been published. The Preventive Medicine special issue on team science in 2008, I think. And then this book came out in 2020. So there's a growth of this literature. When we talk about team science, there are at least a couple of things that scholars have focused on. One is, how do you promote good social integration and cohesion in a team? Because you can have some teams that just don't get along. They don't sort of coalesce in a productive way. The other thing is fostering intellectual synergy. So not just team interpersonal cohesion, but how do you get that creativity going? And that's what we were doing before. These are some other cases where we've used the idea tree at conferences and research centers here at UCI to incubate and integrate new ideas, novel ideas. And as one of you pointed out, this is just a first step, and it's not as detailed and thorough as we might want to get, but it's a starting point. And then you can get together and see what came out of the idea tree today in terms of taking those ideas further in a systematic, meaningful way. When we talk about intellectual and interpersonal synergy, there's an interesting relationship that happens. For teams that are really non-cohesive or they're conflicted, where people aren't getting along, they feel that this person's methodology is weak and my methodology is better or my theory is better, you're not going to get a lot of intellectual synergy out of that low point. By the same token, if everybody's thinking alike and everybody's hugging each other and it's warm and fuzzy, but there's no kind of challenge, you also don't get as much intellectual synergy. So there's a kind of sweet spot of interpersonal synergy where you get the most creative synergy or intellectual. So that's an interesting balance that we think about. Another thing that happens when we think about training team scientists, and that could include groups like yourself, and it could include more advanced senior professors who come together and want to get training in this. We talk about generic core competencies for research. And those are skills that aren't rooted in a particular discipline. They're skills that have to do with, how do you integrate across different levels of a system, or, from a biological system to a social structural system. But these are generic competencies. How do you collaborate in ways that produce sort of useful outcomes rather than devolving into debates and lack of trust and things like that? And then we have substantive competencies. So in the field of biophotonics, there are certain disciplinary-based methodological skills, theoretical perspectives that you want to be aware of. But a lot of times, these kind of generic competencies are left out of the training. So one of the things we've tried to do at UCI is talk about these 4 T's of research and training in the 21st century. And these are sort of the generic competencies. How do you do transdisciplinary work, team-based work, translational from basic science to practice, and transcultural? How do teams from around the world collaborate on the internet across time zones and across many different fields? And this is an example of that kind of collaboration at the CERN Center in Switzerland, where they're looking at ion collider experiments. This is called the ALICE collaboration, a large ion collider experiment. But their papers, their initial papers published in scientific journals had 2,000 authors. So team science can be huge. It can involve really big teams. And these competencies of the 4 Ts are complemented by systems thinking, training in what is a system, a complex system, how do you navigate those systems, normative and ethical competence in research, divergent thinking and creative capacity. These are not discipline-based. These are those generic competencies. Ooh, I'm sorry. What did I do here? Okay. Inclusive leadership. If I'm going to run a team center, collaborative team science center, how do I include all disciplines and make them all feel like they have a place in the center rather than privileging my own field over someone else's? Multiculturalism, which is an important aspect of many fields of research. Co-production of knowledge by scholars and community stakeholders. Science communication, what are some of the best practices of getting our findings out to the public? And digital literacy, how do we know what's real, what isn't real on the internet? How do we use collaborative tools on the internet to collaborate across large distances? So these are some of those generic core competencies. And when we talk about being transdisciplinary, this is a typology that's often used in the field of team science. And it uses the fruit analogy. So the single piece of fruit, the apple, is unidisciplinarity. Researchers from a single discipline work together to address a common problem. The fruit basket is multidisciplinary. So researchers are from different fields. They work sequentially. There might be a white paper that someone's working on where you have a sociologist and an urban planner and a geographer and a biologist contribute to that paper on, let's say, juvenile delinquency or something, but they don't integrate, they don't interact a lot, but they're just putting their pieces together. That's more of a multidisciplinary fruit basket. The fruit salad is more interdisciplinary. So researchers are from different fields and they're working jointly to address a common problem. So there's more interaction, more integration, but they don't really leave their home base. In other words, their field of training, their particular worldview of science. This fruit smoothie is where things are blended a lot more. And what's happening here, and this is sort of the nirvana of this continuum, researchers from different disciplines work jointly to develop and use a shared conceptual framework that synthesizes and extends discipline-specific theories, concepts, and methods to create new approaches. Often you get hybrid fields coming from this. So you might get psychoneuroimmunology or biophotonics is a hybrid field. So these are transdisciplinary innovations, as well as conceptual frameworks where people are willing to leave the comfort and safety of their own models and embrace working together with others, a brand new conceptualization. So that's more transdisciplinary. Does that seem clear? I mean, it's like a kind of a simple analogy, but these are terms that are being used in the field of team science in terms of being familiar with those. Now, there's a whole ecology of collaboration in team science, from the individual team members working in a particular team setting, and it might be a research center at a university where they're in a particular physical, spatial, social, organizational environment. And they may be collaborating with other teams at the same campus or at other universities, these teams 2, 3, and 4. So this is the institutional multi-team system. And then you've got influences on collaborative science beyond the team and its immediate environmental and institutional context. And that would be influenced by funding priorities, what NSF and NIH is willing to fund these days, which is kind of a moving target, government policies, private sector influence, NGOs. So they impinge on team science. And when you're putting a proposal together, it's good to know about that ecology and what's required at each level, to have a successful proposal. So we're looking from, the 30,000-foot level funding agency and foundation support, institutional incentives at your particular university or organization, team level supports, and cultivating individual core competencies, these generic competencies I mentioned. Now, when we start looking across those levels, let's say at the more macro level funding agencies, a lot of government agencies and foundations are now requiring are supporting cross-disciplinary initiatives, and they're requiring collaboration plans. So you have to spell out, well, why do we have the resources to get this done, being a very diverse team? Are the people submitting the proposal well-versed in collaboration? Have they done this before? Do they have a track record at that? Because a lot of times when money is put toward these interdisciplinary centers, it goes to waste if things blow up and the teams take the money and then they don't get along and they don't produce much. So a lot of agencies are now requiring those collaboration plans. And it's important to know, okay, what are the areas that we should cover in our collaboration plan from, how ready are we to engage in this collaboration? Do we have the technologies to collaborate across geographical distance? Communication, coordination, training. How are we going to train people in this center? So those are some of the things you have to think about when you're putting in a collaboration plan, and they get evaluated by the agency. And there's a website that I'll tell you about after I show the slides at UCI that we put together, a Team Scholarship Acceleration Lab website, where it has resources, a lot of resources for doing these kind of things. In fact, there are boilerplate statements about how is your team science going to be addressed in the center, based on earlier examples. And there are ways, how do you put a collaboration plan together? So those are all resources you should know about. Institutional leverage points can be everything from giving seed grant teams shared space and facilities, seed grants, sharing credit widely among the members of a team, education and training initiatives to prepare people to do this kind of work, and tenure and promotion criteria. A lot of times tenure boards really want to see what you've done individually and what journals you're publishing in. More and more, they're open to and want to know about what are your collaborative contributions? How did you help get a grant funded for a center? How did you help develop the conceptual framework for that team project, et cetera? So let me start with shared space and facilities. There was a study of medical research buildings at the University of Michigan. And this is one of those buildings. And the orange and the blue lines show two people's pathways when they come into the building, where they work, what restrooms they use, what coffee places they use on that floor, and where their activities overlap, shared activities. And what they found was if they're in the same building rather than different buildings, they're 33% more likely to collaborate. If they're on the same floor, they're 24% more likely to collaborate. And overlapping activity zones like these here, people that share those activity zones are more likely to receive joint grants. So you can, if you're interested, we'll put these slides up and post them, and you can, check out some of the articles that's based on. But that's what we mean by how facilities and the environment can affect collaboration. You can also affect collaboration by using the environment as a symbol. So this is a healthcare management agency in Southern California that puts its vision and value statement up on the wall for any visitors or employees to see every time they come in the building. This is a environmental impact report center in Irvine, where around this nice meal space, they put up corporate projects so people can see when they visit, or the employees there can appreciate the products of their work. That same company in the conference room puts up photographs of workers. They put up their awards that they've gotten. So people, it's a way of strengthening team identity. And some companies actually provide these kind of resources where people can relax and take time outs in a meditation room, with aquaria and the like. So you can convey some of those team properties through, it's not just about the adjacencies and the structure of the physical environment, it's also about the symbolism, or what some people call semiotics, a field of symbolic messages. So you can have a meal room like that in a building, or you can have one like this, which is comfortable, but also uses the environment to communicate what that group is doing. Or you can have a conference room like that, which says nothing. It's like a blank slate of who's meeting there, or one like this that tells you a lot about who's involved in that company. So those are some ways the environment supports team science. The institution can support team science. At UCI, when it comes to tenure and promotion criteria, our group worked with the Office of Academic Personnel to incorporate into the guidelines for faculty research statements, like when you come up for promotion, you describe your research, your teaching, your service. Well, now when you come up, you can also talk about your collaborative contributions to scholarship. Not everybody's doing team science, so you don't have to do that. But if you are, then they want to know things like, well, how did you contribute? Key idea behind the work, helping to obtain grant funding, bringing statistical expertise, overall project administration, leadership, liaison to community groups, creating research papers, theoretical ideas, frameworks. So if you go to this site at our Office of Academic Personnel, you'll see 31 collaborative contributions that people could potentially talk about, from getting the grant, developing the framework, disseminating the results, et cetera. So not all universities are doing this, but UCI, to their credit, is making collaborative scholarship something that counts. So you don't just, like, if you're a co-author on a paper with 10 people and you happen to be author number 5 or 6, some universities will say, well, you're not the lead author, you're not a solo author, not a big deal. But a lot of times, like I mentioned that paper with 2,000 authors in Switzerland, it takes that kind of synergy to make it work. So, we want to credit people for that effort and not ignore it. When we talk about what's an effective team, in the field of organizational behavior, often there are like 3 dimensions. One being outputs. Is the team putting out good stuff? Like the Beatles put out a lot of good music. Member satisfaction. How well does the team meet members' needs? Do those team members want to keep working together, or do they want to escape that research center because it's a pain and they don't get along and they don't feel their ideas are taken seriously, et cetera? And the other is team viability. So the Beatles, not so much, but the Rolling Stones, 50 plus years, right? So the willingness of members to remain in the team. Those are some criteria for what's an effective team. And if we want to influence that, what are some ways to do that? Well, how do you compose the team? Who's on the team? What are the different knowledge bases they bring? Do they have a strong commitment to collaboration? Are they going to get along together? Do they have a good leader that is inclusive? Education and training. We're talking about training up these generic core competencies, not just the disciplinary, but the generic core competencies for good collaboration. And leadership and management. Like I said, you need leaders who know how to lead with a soft touch, where they're not overly privileging their own perspectives and leaving out others in the team or in the center. Diverse composition of teams is really, really important. There are a number of studies that show that teams that have a balance of males and females on the team in science, as compared to those that are all males or mostly males, they are more impactful, they're more productive. And so there's a lot of research on gender diversity in teams. There's also these other categories of diversity, like what kind of different knowledge bases people bring together, their differences in cultural background, what kind of social network ties they have. So all of these areas of diversity become really important in making that team vibrant. And just like when we did the idea tree, the more diverse your perspectives are sitting around the table, the more potential for sort of leaps, serendipitous leaps between previously unconnected fields or points of view. So diversity becomes pretty important. I mentioned convergence and divergence, and this is a model. One of my colleagues in the School of Social Ecology wrote this book on creativity and research. And she sees divergent thinking, she sees it as a cycle where, kind of like a Coke bottle, where you start out very divergent, you start to converge and sift through what all this divergence sort of produced. And you go through another period of divergence and then convergence, and finally you have some kind of outputs from the center. So there is this interplay, this kind of back and forth between divergent thinking and convergence. And centers that are all about convergence or only about convergence leave out that potential for divergent creativity. Divergence and convergence are the intellectual plane, and then you have this dissension cohesion on the social plane, the intellectual and the interpersonal synergy. And you want enough divergence so that there's stimulation, but you don't want it so extreme that people can't talk to each other. They don't know how to connect. And you want a little bit of dissensus or some dissensus in terms of debate and people feeling comfortable debating, but you don't want it to break down to mistrust, people not getting along. So, but if you're too cohesive and you're too convergent, then you don't get that edge, where you get more synergy intellectually. So that's a balancing thing, as I mentioned before. This is an example of a study we did, actually at a research center here at UCI, where there were neuroscientists and behavioral scientists working on the field of tobacco use and research. And what we found when we measured the members of this team, the red bars are the neuroscientists, the green bars are the social scientists. And we asked them about their satisfaction with the center and their ratings of scientific integration over multiple time points in that 5-year center from fall 2001 to fall 2003. And you can see this divergence here between satisfaction and integration across those groups of people. And this is like too much divergence. What you got here is something we call fault lines, where the center splits into different factions, and then those factions don't connect. No, I want to have the colloquium scheduled at our building. No, I want it over here. You guys need to walk over here. I mean, things like that come up. And so it starts, usually those are inconsequential minor issues. But if you start to have a situation where you have two groups who want the research to go in different directions and they don't agree, sometimes that can create a fault line. So there are limits to how much divergence and diversity is functional. But in general, as I said before, the more you can incorporate certain types of diversity into the composition of a team, the better. It's really important to educate people for this cross-disciplinary 21st century research. And this is here at UCI where we have undergraduates from different majors working in a course where they're asked to create team projects across 2 or more majors. And so we start at the undergrad level, which I think is important to do. And we try to shape what we call a transdisciplinary orientation, which is a kind of personal disposition to engage in integrative cross-disciplinary research and practice. And it encompasses one's beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, conceptual and methodological approaches. Some people don't want to do that. Some people are a lot better and more productive at just drilling down on their very specific field. Other people are more, they find it more natural to want to collaborate across fields. So not everybody has to do this kind of work. And you need to think about, where do I fit best, or what's my best competencies? But if you're going to do team science, then these are some of the things you think about. And if you're composing a team, then you want people whose beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, their worldviews of science are, compatible and committed to doing that hard work of collaboration. Because if they're not committed, it's not going to happen. And behaviors are things like, oh, I go to conferences outside my field, or I read journals outside my field, and I make a point to do that. Or I meet regularly with people from outside my field to create new ideas, like if you're in a research center that's very multidisciplinary. So that's what we mean by a transdisciplinary orientation. And it emerges very gradually over the course of one's career, and it's shaped through all of your educational and professional experiences, where you went to high school, college, grad school, et cetera. So it's a very sort of long-term kind of product, having that type of that orientation. But you need to think about that, and there are ways to assess. We have scales to assess transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, unidisciplinary orientations, so that a group can get a sense of where they stand. And if everybody's kind of in a unidisciplinary mode, the collaboration isn't going to work as well. In summary, across the research that's been done in this field, some of the factors that seem to predict success are people sharing a strong commitment to cross-disciplinary collaboration. So when you get that team grant, don't just go back to your silos, but people are willing to really do the hard work of integration. Members bring very diverse skills, knowledge, and personal qualities and attributes to the team, so that there is that kind of nice mix that's relevant to the problem that the team's studying. Leaders have collaborative, inclusive orientations rather than exclusionary approaches where they think their approach is the best and the only way. And that happens sometimes when the wrong kind of team leaders get in charge. Strong institutional support for cross-disciplinary collaboration. I mentioned a number of those, from physical space to tenure and promotion guidelines, seed grants, all of that. Environments and technologies that enable collaboration. More and more people are collaborating on the internet across very vast geographical spaces, different time zones. So the group has to be equipped with the right resources to do that. And ample training and experience in cross-disciplinary science. So a lot of these research agencies and foundations are looking for, what's the track record here? What's the expertise? And if you don't have it already, how are you going to train that up in the trainees, for example, or the fellows? In closing, I have listed here a number of resources for team science and the websites where you can go and get this information. This is a toolbox for co-production of knowledge between scholars and community members. And I have a couple of show and tells here. So this is the National Academy's book on advancing the effectiveness of team science. This is a really valuable short thumbnail sketch of team science competencies. It's put out by the National Cancer Institute and NIH, and it's called the Collaboration and Team Science Field Guide. And it's got very digestible best practices. And I would urge you to get that if you're interested in team science. And you can just go to the website and this website here and pull that down. So those are some resources you'll have. One last point, if I can let me just bring up the T-cell website. Oh, connection. Let's see if I'm connected here. Yeah, maybe I'm not on the network. Can we bring it up on on another computer?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just tcell.uci.edu.
Oh, they're not
T,
saying that.
T,
They're not saying- I don't want to use this. I was already, where's this extended desktop?
oh yeah, tcell.uci, TSAL. .uci.edu. Yeah, okay. There
But
it
they're
is.
not saying that. It's
Yeah.
like,
Oh,
I don't know. Oh, okay, so it's that way. So now. There we go.
oh, good, great.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see.
Setting up more.
Let's see. I'm not seeing it here, though. Where's
Oh,
it?
yeah, the mouse. Yeah, it's that short. You have to look. You want to go here, right?
Where's it? Oh, yeah. Okay. So what this site, as I mentioned, it's a set of resources for team science. And it talks about some of us that are involved in that lab. If you want, general information about team scholarship, why it's important, some of the challenges that face team science, effective team science, different work styles, lack of common ground, effective leadership. Some of the things that I mentioned. And then when you go up to this other tab, the toolkit, there are 3 sets of resources that correspond to the phases of a collaborative team. One is gathering the team together. And here you have a lot of different kinds of resources on getting ready to collaborate, becoming the leader of a science collaboration, pulling a team together. Here you have how to write a collaboration plan, a sample paragraph for, if I was putting together a proposal and I needed to talk about how team science will be involved, this is a kind of template for that type of thing. So there are a lot of sort of very practical things. And then if you go to launching the team and getting the team going, there are, again, a lot of different resources in terms of creating psychological safety for different ideas, communication strategies, norms of collaboration. So there's much to pull down here, a suite of tools that support collaboration. And then finally, if you go to this getting the work done here, again, you have issues related to dissemination of the research, what happens when conflict comes up, how to create a positive mood, knowing about the different phases of collaboration from forming, storming, norming, and transforming, and adjourning. So there are these different phases that often come up in team science projects. So I'd encourage you to just kind of explore that. If you go to tsal.uci.edu, you can see the whole thing there. So with that, let me stop here and take any questions or thoughts you might have about what I presented. I know I went a little bit quickly, but you seem to be tracking it okay. So anything before you break for lunch that you want to raise?
Good.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I hope you'll find this useful as you go through the rest of the course and your own work. So thanks again.
And then any questions or? Dan, I guess I have one. And so, a lot of the trainees here, they don't necessarily always have the luxury of picking their team right now. They're to a large extent, their team is their lab. So in terms of just thinking about it from their, putting yourself in their shoes, what are some of the best practices you think they should be thinking about in terms of, working within their labs, or, maybe they're going to work with a clinician or a biologist, for instance, what are the sorts of things that you think they should be thinking about from a team science perspective?
Yeah, so I think the continuum of disciplinary diversity is quite variable, and a lot of the principles I talked about in terms of good collaboration would apply to same field research teams or labs. You're going to have people, even within the same field, are going to have different points of view or different methodological preferences. There's going to be the issue of how do you cross-stimulate a kind of fertilization of ideas that the different team members have, even if they're in the same field. So I think a lot of those principles apply, but then in terms of looking at your careers over a longer period, as you progress through different stages of your career, it's likely you're going to bump into some of these issues of being a team member in a very diverse team. And what are some best practices for that? So what I was trying to give you here was kind of a roadmap of where to look if you find yourself in that situation. Because a lot of, for example, my students getting their PhDs, going into their first jobs, a lot of the positions are requiring that kind of collaborative mindset or ability to, plug into research teams that are diverse. So I think that's going to come up more and more because of the complexity of the problems we're trying to solve. So yeah, I think even though you might be in a single field lab right now, you're probably going to run into these issues more and more as you go through your careers. And again, there's so many good resources out there from the National Academies, NSF, and this website categorizes a lot of those. So you can go to those links I mentioned on this TSAL website and pull down reports and even scales to measure some of the things I talked about. Yeah. Any other thoughts you have? Yes, Jan.
The balance of females, can you talk about that again? What you said?
Yeah, there's Anita Woolley is one of the Wooley, if you look up her work. She's done a lot of work on this, but they've traced it to kind of social sensitivity and being able to read nonverbal facial cues. And not to be sexist, but this seems to be something that female members of a team are more adept at. And so when you have teams that have that kind of, capacity or asset within it, it tends to lead to better collaboration and more productivity. So the mechanisms that account for that are still being studied, but there's a fair amount of evidence about it if you go to that literature. Yes.
Labs and the productivity, so, because the comparison was between labs that were all men and then labs taught also women and some. Right?
You mean like gender homogeneous versus mixed?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not actually sure about whether those homogeneous teams were studied. What I recall is where you had lopsided representation of males relative to more balanced gender. But Woolley's work, if you go to her work, there are a number of studies that have been done that build on each one. So you can, those kind of questions would be answered, I think, from looking at those papers. Yeah.
We can wrap this up then. Thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Great to meet you all. Thanks again for your participation in the idea tree. I hope that